Good evening, everyone. I'm going to start with a question, a little audience participation. Raise your hand if you've ever been in a circumstance where you knew the right thing to do, but failed to do it. That was so fast. Me too. And I'm worried about this. I'm worried about this at the individual level. I'm worried about this at the species level, particularly in the context of climate change. Now, as you heard, I'm an academic, so eventually I'll get to my research. But I thought I would start with a personal narrative so that you all understand a little bit more as to why I care so much about these issues. So growing up in Canada, I had a mom who loved nature. She absolutely adored nature. And on the weekends, she'd take me for walks at nature preserves. We go for long walks along the beaches of Lake Ontario, where I had to step around all the dead fish because the lake was so polluted. And what we would be doing is collecting beach glass, which, if you're unfamiliar, are pieces of glass that enter the ecosystem. They're churned in the sand and the water, and as a result, they become smooth and opaque. Now, studies show if you introduce youth to nature via a mentor who values nature, the probability of that youth valuing nature increases. And that was certainly the case with me. So fast forward to undergrad, I landed in a body by no merit of my own, just the accidents of birth, that was privileged such that I had access to higher education. And I'd like for us to think just for a second about what a wonderful world it would be if the accidents of birth didn't dictate whether you had access to things like higher education, a roof over your head, food in your belly, decent health care, and so on. So I was lucky. I got to go to university. And while I was in university, I took an environmental ethics class. And in this class, I had an aha moment. I was like, oh my goodness, these arguments are so good. These are knocked down, airtight, totally logical arguments that prove, without a doubt, that we have to protect nature. And this young version of myself thought, if I make a life out of identifying these arguments, educating about these issues, maybe even coming up with some arguments of my own, certainly I'll be helping the planet. Certainly I'll be doing good in the world. Fast forward to me teaching ethics. It was the end of this class. 2 students were exiting. I don't think I was meant to hear this. It certainly had a profound effect. One of them said to the other under their breath, "This class is so," insert expletive, "depressing." So just to be clear, this class is so depressing. I was devastated. I thought class had gone well that day. So around this time, I was reading the IPCC Report, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, which has membership from every single country in the world. So if you're looking for a reputable resource, I highly recommend it. And if you're a member of the human family who doesn't believe in climate change, we don't even have to debate. Whether you believe in climate change or not, we're making the air unbreathable, the water undrinkable. We're decimating species at such a rate, it's called the 6th grade extinction. We don't need to debate. Whether you believe in climate change or not, we have to radically alter the way we're treating the non-human environment. But if you read the report, it's crystal clear. If we continue with business as usual, life as we know it and value it cannot continue. So I'm reading this report, and I'm looking at the news. I'm reading the report, I'm looking at the news, and there's this massive disconnect between what we know to be the case and the action that would reflect it. So too in my classes. So here I was introducing my students to these amazing theoretical lenses that they could use to solve these moral conundrums. And one of the things I tell my students is, we can't fix something we can't see. So we have to look at these tough issues, even though it's difficult. Instead of my students walking out feeling like they can transform the world in ways consistent with their own reflectively held beliefs and values, they were depressed. So I did what academics do when we get worried. I researched. So I'm trained in the Western tradition of philosophy, and at least as far back as Plato, folks have been worried about this. So Plato discusses in the Protagoras, akrasia, which gets translated as weakness of the will, and he does this using the character of Socrates. And what Socrates says is, when people fail to do that which is right, it's because they're ignorant. Unfortunately, study after study in the environmental literature shows that knowing the right thing to do with the environment does not necessarily result in behavior consistent with this knowledge. So we need to do more than remedy ignorance. So I jumped back into the research, and motivation kept popping up. I was reading moral psychology. And I thought, what a gorgeous bridge from theory to action, motivation. So I'm drawing in the air. This is the bridge. You need to not only have theoretical understanding, but that knowledge needs to motivate you to act in the world. However, if you're talking about motivation, you're talking about emotion. And if you're talking about emotion in the Western tradition, things get worrisome really, really fast. And when I'm talking about the Western tradition, I don't just mean Western philosophy, I mean Western culture. And as you can recall, Western culture has steamrolled numerous other cultures across the planet, so it's quite dominant. Within Western culture, we have what's called the reason-emotion dualism. It's a value hierarchical dualism. So what do I mean by this? Let's unpack it. When I say dualism, you can think two, dual, and we're supposed to imagine these things as though they're fundamentally distinct and different, complete opposites. And it's a value hierarchy. So one has elevated stature, the other one is denigrated. And in the reason-emotion dualism, there are layers of race and there are layers of gender. So reason gets associated with white, able-bodied, cisgender, upper-class males with a presumed rhetorical credibility, and emotion gets associated with oppressed groups and women in particular. So here are some problems. First of all, if you cut up the world such that you have a privileged group and an oppressed group, you are baking into the system fundamental injustice. You are creating the conditions for systematic oppression. Another problem, you're basically saying to your population, if you land in that kind of body, you don't get to emote. If you think you're having something that feels like an emotion, repress, avoid, deny. Yes, it is the case. For you to be a fully functional, healthy human being, you need to have a rich emotional life. Sorry about your luck. And then you're pointing at people over here and saying, if you happen to land in that body, oh, honey, you're so emotional. You can't help it. It's just the way you are. So much so that anytime you speak, anyone can decide to dismiss what you're saying because it's emotional and therefore irrational. Sorry about your luck. Here's another problem. Reason and emotion don't actually come apart in the way the reason-emotion dualism suggests that they do. This is an empirical, scientific concern. And I'll give you an example. Anger. When you're angry about something, you're identifying something in the world. Usually it's an injustice. You've got a judgment associated with that and a sensation. In my case, it's a fire in my belly that gets me up off the couch and out in the world. And if either of these were missing, you wouldn't call the emotion anger. So anger is what's called a cognitive emotion. By definition, it's got a cognitive element, and there's lots and lots of cognitive emotions. So all of this to say, we have a fantastic bridge from theory to action. It's called emotion, and I suspect in the Western tradition we are not paying enough attention to it because the reason-emotion dualism is hanging in the wings. So what are some of the emotions that people are feeling in the context of climate change? Folks are reporting things like eco-fatigue, ecophobia, such a sense of overwhelm and dread that rather than look at this thing, this terrifying thing of our own creation called climate change, people are putting their heads in the sand. And I don't necessarily fault them. I think for a lot of folks, it's about emotional survival. However, once you discover you can cultivate tools so that you can act in the face of that which terrifies you, then you have a responsibility to cultivate those tools. So, what are some of the emotions that are particularly good at empowering, particularly in ethics? You can think about things like hope, which I'll focus on, sympathy, compassion. And this is, I think, really important about hope. I'll give you my account. There's lots of accounts. This is my account. For a hope to be justified, you need a higher than zero probability of the hoped for thing coming into being. It can't be impossible. If it's impossible, then it's more like wishful thinking. You wouldn't call that justified hope. And if it's guaranteed to happen, you don't need hope because you have certainty. But in between, you've got probabilities. The higher the probability of the thing you want to happen happening, the higher your hope can be. Now, we can consider what's reasonable to hope for in the context of climate change. I'm going to give two examples. One is the Hard Knocks version. And before I go there, I just want to remind everyone, each human being is a universe of ideas. And we have not, as a human family, collaborated in the way that we have to solve this particular issue. I'm curious and I'm excited about the possibilities that arise when we do. Just putting that out there before we talk about hope in the context of climate change. So here's the Hard Knocks version. Let's say you go home tonight, you're watching the news, you're shaking your head, you're thinking, meh, this does not look good. We're going to go extinct. We're going to take down all these exquisite creatures with us, not to mention complex ecosystems. We're going to stop there. Sometimes when people hear that humans are going extinct, their response is, party, we can do whatever we want, we're going extinct. To which I respond, no. Of course not. We all die one day. It doesn't mean everything we do between now and then is irrelevant, so too in the context of climate change. So let's bracket that and put that aside. But what is reasonable to hope for? I think some really important things. For example, as climate change harms escalate and the number of climate refugees escalates, and they will escalate, we've got them, there will be more, I'm hopeful that people in positions of privilege, including geographic privilege, respond to their human kin, their human family, with compassion, with human decency, and prioritize their lives over and above these social political constructs that we call borders. They're social political constructs. We make them up. They could be otherwise. Okay, the second hope is audacious. I think we can actually do it, though. I really do. You need 3.5% of a population out and loud for a government to have to listen. 3.5% of a population for a government to necessarily reflect the will of the people or dissolve. Now add up every environmental not-for-profit, grassroots organization, student group. If you work for a business, think about sustainability initiatives, community gardens. Think about the 7.6 million people who participated in the climate strike. Think about youth organizing at a rate and with an efficacy we have never seen before, such that they are able to talk to people in positions of very high power, trying to hold them accountable. When your youth tell you, stop being immoral, you're destroying the possibility of my future, you listen. Think of every single person who is sitting at home tonight, right now, who cares, who really cares about these issues, but has not yet cultivated the capacities required to act in the face of that which terrifies them. Add them all together. 3.5% is inherently doable. It is inherently doable. And what hope theory shows is that high hopers, so people who are particularly good at hope, tend to identify small, manageable goals. They have paths to those goals. When they hit blocks to those paths, they come up with other ones. So they're highly successful. They recalibrate as needed. And when they achieve that goal, they have bigger goals and bigger goals and bigger goals. And when hopeful people work together in community, they scaffold each other, they support each other. There is literally hope that spreads into the world from these communities because hope is an emotion and emotions are catchy. And this is an important thing about hope. When hopeful people act hopefully, the horizon of what it's reasonable to hope for shifts in really exciting ways. So if everybody goes home tonight and it's business as usual tomorrow morning, what we have to hope for is not very inspiring. If instead people go home tonight and they wake up tomorrow and they say, oh my goodness, I care about these issues, I want to do something. What's my skill set? How do I get involved? What organization do I have to work with so my government has to listen to what's important to me? Nay, my government and corporations. And I demand not only systems that are sustainable, but that promote thriving. I am beside myself with excitement at what becomes reasonably possible if we move in this direction. So my invitation tonight is to courageously cultivate the capacity to hope, so that when you're walking with a kid that you love in a natural environment, you can say, hey kiddo, I care about the environment, so this is what I'm doing to protect it and to make your future more livable. Thank you.